Put your hands in the air. Officer Brad Hawkins barked, his voice cutting through the hum of the busy street. I can't, officer, Sasha Steele replied, gripping her crutches tightly. Her eyes stayed locked on his, steady despite the tension. I need to hold my crutches for support. You can see I have one leg. I don't care. Do as you're told. Hawkins snapped, stepping closer, his hand brushing against his holstered weapon. If I try, I'll fall, Sasha said, her voice calm but firm. I'm not a threat. The only thing I have on me is my crutches. You think you're special? Obey orders, you ghetto urchin. His words were harsh, loud enough to draw the attention of passers-by. Sasha's brows furrowed. Excuse me, officer. Why have you stopped me, really? And why are you speaking to me in this manner? You're loitering, begging, probably planning to steal. Hawkins folded his arms, his posture rigid with authority. Sasha shook her head. I'm waiting for my friend. She's returning an item inside, she explained, nodding toward the boutique behind her. Hawkins sneered, taking a step forward. Don't play games with me. Put your hands up. Then, without warning, he shoved her shoulder and tried to take her crutches from her forcefully. Sasha gasped as she stumbled backward, struggling to stay upright. Her crutches wobbled, and she barely managed to steady herself. Around them, onlookers froze in disbelief. A few pulled out their phones, their cameras capturing the moment. Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the crowd. She's disabled, man. What are you doing? A voice called out from the bystanders, but Hawkins didn't flinch. The upscale street, once filled with idle chatter and the clinking of shopping bags, had fallen silent, every eye now on the scene unfolding before them. Before we get into this story fully, I'm so glad you could join us for today's story. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And if you believe that everyone deserves to be treated with love and respect, no matter the color of their skin or the way they look, hit that subscribe button to join the movement. Now let's continue. She didn't do anything, another voice shouted. Hawkins turned his head briefly toward the onlookers, his jaw tightening. Mind your own business, he barked, his tone as sharp as a whip. Sasha felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the sheer injustice of the moment. Her dress was now rumpled, her carefully maintained composure shattered. She looked at the faces of the crowd, many of them holding up their phones, recording her humiliation. Please, just listen to me. She tried again, her voice firmer this time. I was waiting for my friend. She's inside the store. She will be out soon, please. I don't want any trouble. I wasn't loitering or trespassing. Hawkins ignored her, shoving her toward the open door of the patrol car. She stumbled, nearly falling, but caught herself at the last moment. The metal of the cuffs bit into her wrists as he forced her inside. The door slammed shut behind her, cutting off the protests of the crowd. Sasha's chest tightened as she sat in the cramped back seat, her crutches visible through the rear window, lying discarded on the pavement. Outside, the bystanders continued to voice their outrage, their phones still pointed at the scene, but Hawkins paid them no mind as he climbed into the driver's seat. Sasha stared out the window, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. Her humiliation was complete, but a spark of defiance flickered in her heart. This wasn't the end, she told herself. Not by a long shot. The crowd outside the boutique grew restless, their murmurs rising into shouts. They drove in utter silence. Officer Hawkins made stops for a coffee and a burger at 2 intervals, and each time he left her inside the hot car for hours. When he got back, he offered no explanations or even an apology. Saha sucked it in. She didn't have her phone on her. She couldn't call for help. She just prayed silently that he was taking her to the police station. And she prayed that when her friend comes out of the boutique and finds her missing, she would ask around and know where she is or who had taken her. She had to stay strong. When they got to the police station, Officer Hawkins denied her rights to a phone call. He quickly filed in some paperwork and locked her in a cell. No one spoke to her. Everybody went about their businesses like she did not exist. She tried to ask for help, but no one gave her a listening ear. back in her cold, unwelcoming holding, with its walls a dull gray that seemed to absorb all warmth and hope. Sasha sat stiffly on the metal bench, her arms crossed against the chill. Her thoughts were interrupted by the voice of the woman sitting across from her. "So what are you in for?" the woman asked. She was wiry, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Sasha glanced at her. "Loitering and trespassing, apparently," she said, her voice edged with bitterness. "Even though I was just waiting for my friend outside a boutique." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Figures. They love to make something out of nothing, especially when you are black and powerless. What's your name?" "Sasha," she replied. "Yours?" "Marta." Marta leaned back, studying her. "You don't look fazed by all of these, though. Have you been arrested before? Looks like you've dealt with this kind of thing before." Sasha hesitated, then let out a heavy sigh. "Not exactly this, but I've been through worse." Marta tilted her head. "Worse? Like what? Losing your leg?" Sasha stared at the scratched floor, the memories flooding back. "Yes." "That must have been tough. How did that happen?" Martha asked. "When I was 15, I was hit by a drunk driver on my way home from piano lessons. I ended up in a ditch, my leg broken so badly I couldn't move. I screamed for hours until finally a police car stopped." Sasha narrated, holding back the tears welling up in her eyes. "That sounds awful," Marta said softly. "It gets worse," Sasha continued, her voice steady but her jaw tight. "The officer got out, shined his flashlight on me, and just looked at me. Then he muttered something under his breath, something about me being black, and he left." Marta's eyes widened. "He just left you there?" Sasha nodded, the anger in her chest as fresh as it had been that night. "By the time someone else found me, it was too late. The nerves in my broken leg had died, and they had to amputate my leg because of how long I'd been lying there with no help." Marta shook her head, disbelief and anger written all over her face. "That's sick." "That's why I promised myself I'd become a lawyer," Sasha said, her voice firm. "To fight back, to make sure officers like that and the one I experienced today never get away with behaviors like this." Marta smiled faintly. "Good for you. Don't let them break you. You're stronger than this place." Sasha met Marta's gaze and nodded. "I won't. Not this time. Not ever." If you believe that Sasha deserves a lot more than she has gotten so far from the people who are supposed to protect and serve her, hit the subscribe button to show your support for Sasha. Back at the police station, Sasha tried to stay awake. She prayed fervently that her friend would come, ma'am. But her friend never came. She was tired and dirty and sweaty, and before long, she closed her eyes and tried to get some sleep. She was hopeful that she had only lost the battle today, but tomorrow she would win the war. In the morning, an officer brought her to a small office. Sasha sat in the small office, and across the desk, a stern-faced officer scribbled notes as she recounted the events of her arrest. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. When he was done, he told her her friend had met bail requirements, and she was free to go. Sasha thanked him, and to everyone's shock, she said, "I want to file a complaint for harassment and racial profiling," she stated firmly, meeting the officer's gaze. "What the officer who brought me in did was unacceptable, and he needs to be held accountable." The officer sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Look, Hawkins was just doing his job. Maybe you misinterpreted the situation." Sasha's jaw tightened. "I didn't misinterpret being shoved, humiliated, and arrested without cause." Outside the office, Sasha could hear murmurs from other officers, their words faint but clear enough. "He's a good cop. She is probably just overreacting." Sasha squared her shoulders. "This isn't over," she said, determination blazing in her eyes. She left the station, went back home, and took a warm shower. Then she brewed herself a cup of coffee and sat down to make some calls. She called her lawyer. She told him everything she had gone through in the last 24 hours, and they agreed to meet at his office to begin filing a case against Officer Hawkins. About 40 minutes later, Sasha was sitting across from her lawyer, David Miller, in his office, The desk between them was covered with papers, videos, and typed witness statements. David leaned forward, his glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed another testimony. "These videos are solid evidence," he said, tapping one of the devices. "Combined with the witness statements, we have a case." Sasha nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. As she prepared her own statement, her thoughts drifted to her first case after graduating law school, a moment that defined her path. She had been a junior attorney assigned to defend a black teenager wrongfully accused of shoplifting. The odds were stacked against him: a biased system, lack of resources, and a prosecutor eager for a conviction. But Sasha poured her soul into the case, working late nights and digging into every detail. She found video footage that proved the boy's innocence, and during trial, exposed the false testimony of a store clerk. The case was dismissed, but it left a lasting mark on her. "Sasha?" David's voice broke through her reverie. She looked up, fire in her eyes. "I'm ready. Let's make sure this is a fight they don't forget." And so they went to court. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the trial began. Sasha sat beside her lawyer, David Miller, her posture straight, her expression calm but focused. Across the room, Officer Brad Hawkins sat with his attorney, his demeanor confident, even smug. His belief in the system's protection radiated in his relaxed posture and faint smirk. The judge entered, and the murmurs faded to silence as everyone rose. When Judge Timothy Harris entered the courtroom, his eyes scanned the room, pausing abruptly when they landed on Sasha Daniels, seated at the plaintiff's table. His brow furrowed in confusion before his expression softened in recognition. "Judge Sasha Steele," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. "What brings you here today?" The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as people exchanged glances, realizing the judge knew the plaintiff. Sasha looked up, her face calm but resolute, and offered a polite nod. "Good morning, Judge Harris," she replied. "It's a long story. An unfortunate incident with Officer Hawkins has brought me to this side of the courtroom." Judge Harris's eyebrows lifted, his expression shifting to a mix of surprise and concern. "Judge Sasha Steele," he said, addressing the courtroom now, "one of the most notable judges in this city, known for her fairness and dedication to justice. I never imagined seeing you here under these circumstances." He glanced toward Hawkins, whose face had gone pale. The officer sat frozen in his chair, visibly sweating, his usual confidence replaced with a sinking dread. "Well, Judge Sasha," Harris continued, his tone both familiar and professional, "I've always known you to be a champion of justice, both on and off the bench. If you're here, I assume it's for a good reason." Sasha offered a faint smile. "I believe in the system, Judge Harris. Today, I'm hoping to remind others of its purpose." Judge Harris nodded, then shifted his piercing gaze back to Hawkins. The officer squirmed under the scrutiny, his regret written all over his face. "Well," Harris said, his tone now firm, "let's proceed. But let me assure you, Sasha, this court will handle this case with the fairness and integrity you've always stood for." Hawkins felt his stomach churn, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like never before. As the reality of the situation sank in, Officer Brad Hawkins felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. His hands gripped the edge of the defense table tightly, his knuckles turning white. The name Judge Sasha Steele echoed in his mind like a thunderclap, each repetition amplifying his growing dread. She's a judge, not just any judge, but one of the most respected in the city. His earlier smugness had completely evaporated. Hawkins' chest tightened as he recalled the incident, the way he dismissed her, shoved her, and called her a ghetto urchin. He could still see the faces of the crowd that day, shocked, angry, recording everything. Now he understood why her composure had been so unshakable. She wasn't just any citizen. She was someone who stood for everything he had violated that evening. He shifted in his chair, unable to meet Sasha's calm, composed gaze. A bead of sweat trickled down his forehead, and he wiped it away hastily, his movements jerky. Regret churned in his stomach, threatening to make him sick. How could he have been so careless, so arrogant? Hawkins swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. The weight of his actions now felt unbearable. He had profiled and assaulted someone who not only knew the law better than he did, but had likely helped shape it. Each glance from the jury and the judge felt like a spotlight shining on his guilt. His mind raced, searching for a way to salvage his reputation, but the evidence was overwhelming. Hawkins slumped in his chair, his confidence shattered, and a crushing realization settled over him. There would be no escape from this. He had thought he held all the power that day. Now the tables had turned, and Hawkins was left drowning in his own regret and fear. The court proceeding began. Your Honor, today will show clear evidence of Officer Hawkins' misconduct, including video footage, witness testimonies, and a troubling history of racial profiling complaints, the prosecutor stated firmly. Sasha watched as the first video was played. The recording showed Hawkins shoving her into the patrol car while ignoring her attempts to explain. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the footage captured his dismissive tone and aggressive actions. This is one of several videos taken by bystanders, the prosecutor said. Each tells the same story, an officer abusing his authority. Next, witness statements were read aloud. A shopkeeper testified, I saw Miss Sasha standing outside the boutique. She wasn't loitering or trespassing. As a matter of fact, she has shopped with us a lot of times in the past. When I greeted her that evening, she told me she was waiting for her friend. Then came the bombshell, Hawkins' personnel record. The prosecutor held up a folder. Officer Hawkins has been the subject of multiple racial profiling complaints over the past 5 years. Though these complaints were dismissed, they established a troubling pattern. At this, Hawkins shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His confidence continued to falter. David leaned toward Sasha, whispering, This is strong. They can't dismiss all of this. Sasha nodded, her heart pounding. She glanced at the jury, noting their reactions, furrowed brows, narrowed eyes, an occasional shake of the head. They were listening. Judge Harris addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, I remind you that this trial is about justice. We will examine the evidence without bias, and the verdict will be based solely on the facts. That is the standard of this court, and it will be upheld. His words carried weight, silencing any lingering doubts in the room. The trial resumed, but the shift in power was palpable. Hawkins' earlier confidence had cracked, his lawyer's strategy now uncertain. The courtroom was silent, every pair of eyes fixed on Judge Harris as he prepared to deliver the verdict. Sasha Steele sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across the room, Officer Brad Hawkins fidgeted in his chair, his once confident demeanor now replaced with visible tension. Judge Harris adjusted his glasses and looked at the jury's written decision before addressing the room. His voice was calm but firm, carrying the weight of the moment. After thorough deliberation, the jury has found Officer Brad Hawkins guilty of harassment and assault, he announced, his words cutting through the air like a blade. A faint murmur rippled through the room before silence returned. Judge Harris turned his attention to Hawkins, his gaze unflinching. This case has hidden a failure in the system, a system that entrusted you with power and responsibility. Instead of protecting those you served, you abused your authority, targeting an innocent citizen and subjecting her to unnecessary harm and humiliation. He paused, his voice steady and unwavering as he continued, Justice is not about power, it's about accountability. Officer Hawkins, your actions were not just a violation of your duty, but an affront to the very principles of justice. This court will not ignore that. Hawkins' shoulders slumped as the weight of his words settled over him. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, but Hawkins didn't respond, his face pale. Judge Harris looked out over the courtroom, his voice clear as he delivered the sentence. After considering the evidence and the jury's verdict, this court sentences Brad Hawkins to 5 years in prison for harassment and assault. Additionally, you are ordered to undergo mandatory sensitivity training and counseling during your incarceration. The gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial. Sasha exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, a wave of relief washing over her. Justice had been served. not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. As the courtroom emptied, Sasha stood tall, her determination reignited. This was only the beginning of her fight for systemic change. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered in a flurry of cameras and microphones. Sasha stood beside Judge Harris and her lawyer, who addressed the crowd with unwavering conviction. "This isn't just a victory for me," Sasha said, her voice steady and clear. "It's a step forward for every person who's been silenced, ignored, or mistreated by a system meant to protect them. But this step is only the beginning. True change requires continued effort and vigilance." Sasha watched as the crowd hung on every word, feeling a spark of hope ignite. As the crowd dispersed, Sasha returned to her work, her mission unchanged. She would continue to fight for justice, her resilience inspiring others to stand up and demand change. Do you think Officer Hawkins got more than he deserved? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Also, if you enjoyed this story, hit the subscribe button and turn on post notification so you don't miss the next one.